As soon as possible. Thank you, 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 thank you.
We break our committee down into 3 subcommittees: airworthiness, flight operations, and personnel. And we look at that as, the hardware required, the procedures required, and the crew and personnel training requirements required, as well as you have to take a look at the infrastructure that all that's going to feed into. Real quickly, I kind of was thinking like, well, why were they inviting me here today? And I'm still struggling with that a little bit, but after pulling a few threads on it, I think there may be a little bit that we can discuss. But as you develop standards for changing technologies, I think you have to consider how that's going to change the airscape or the landscape or the environment that we're flying in today. And I just put down a couple of topical areas that to consider. And this one's specifically for urban air mobility, but it can be applied to any of the domains, the aviation domains. And what you're taking a look at is, as technologies change, as the infrastructure changes, as I think it's going to, especially with urban air mobility and UAS, specifically in the lower altitudes or the mid altitudes, you have to deal with public perception and acceptance. And there's going to be operational changes, and all that's going to feed into regulatory requirements. Now, I'm not saying that we need to change the regulatory requirements, but we definitely have to consider what the changes in the regulatory requirements may be, and part of that could be flight rules in the future. And that's really all I have for an introduction.
And we'll move now to Olivia Moravitsky, and he's the network manager, or the program manager actually, for airspace management, ATS, air traffic flow management procedures for Eurocontrol. Olivier.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate to this panel. Waiting for the slides. All right. So, as you all know, we start from the point with a new entrant in the airspace that we know. And we need to define and identify who is it. And as you know, we are all overloaded by loads of communication on internet everywhere, every day. The difficulty being to have something stable, validated, robust, that can be used as a basis to compare it with the existing rules. So we need to look at what is existing today, what is a fact, operational capability that exists, that is already in use, what is very likely to be happening tomorrow, and what will happen in the future. That's the starting point. As you know, in Europe, or you may know, the rules of the air are a little bit wider than what Chris just described. We started from the rules of the air as they are in Annex 2. But it was identified that it was also to be extended to a number of additional elements of the regulatory material of ICAO on the services, on the MET, on the air traffic service itself. And that's why we have integrated parts of Annex 11, Doc 4444, even PANSOPS and Annex 3. And as you can see on the slide, we have a wider scope for what has been considered rules of the air in Europe. The methodology that we are following currently in the work that we are doing in the assistance provided to the regulator in Europe is not to look at the letter of the provisions as we know them, but to look at the objectives of the provisions that exist, which means, for example, as you can see on the slide, any system that is flying needs to achieve a certain navigation from A to B or others, vertically, horizontally. And that is covered, for example, in the rules of the air by altimetry, by the VFR and IFR as you know them. Safety needs to be covered as well, primarily to avoid collisions in flight. And for that, in the rules of the air, we find the right-of-way rules, we find the lights to be displayed, for example. And our methodology is to look first at the objectives of the rule before looking at the letter itself to see how possibly we could achieve the same objectives with other ways. A little bit too fast. So, to summarize it, the methodology that we are following is to analyze and sort out the current requirements and capabilities of the new entrant, to confront these requirements and capabilities with the existing rules in the context of the target level of safety that we want to maintain or achieve, and then to identify what could be done, either to adapt the rules or complement them with additional material, to identify what are the minimum required capabilities that any entrants should at least achieve, because there may be some of them as well, and identify if there are other practical solutions, basically a pragmatic approach to considering the existing rules. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And now for another European, actually, Mr. Lorenzo Mazzilli. He's the Manager of Innovation and Digitalization of the Civil Aviation Authority in Switzerland. And it's over to you.
Yes, I'll do a very brief introduction. And I have only 2 slides with 2 words. And the reason for that is that we have seen already the discussion is starting. Do we need new flight rules? Are we developing new flight rules? What are the methodology that we need to apply to look at new entrants? What are their capabilities and so on and so forth? But the first question I wanted to ask, and everybody's on it, what is the need that we are trying to address? Because we are looking at this, revolution which is happening in aviation, call it like that, or disruption, and the needs could be as varied as they can possibly imagine. So are we looking at creating new rules for operation over urban environment for delivery of thousands of drones? Are these new rules to be applied for urban air mobility? Are they need to be applied in all airspace or only in certain classes of airspace? So clearly you can try to take a stab at everything at the same time as an option, or you need to look at the current and, let's say, immediate future needs and try to address that. So I wanted to say, I think the conversation should be framed around the specific needs that we have. Why do we need to change the rules? Why are they not good enough? And for whom are they not good enough? Also considering the fact that it will take a while to change them. So we cannot change them for today's needs. We need to also kind of foresee a little bit what is going to be the need in the future. And the second word is assumptions, because when you start to work on something that, again, it's not yet fully defined, you're going to have to make some assumptions about this. Is general aviation going to be required to equip, or they will never equip more than today? Are we assuming that manned aircraft always gives way? This is a foundation of assumption, or can we say that manned aircraft might have to give way to unmanned in certain situations? So what are the foundational assumptions that we're going to have when we go about developing these flight rules? I think if these are not clear, again, the discussion will be quite wobbly. We're going to go all over the place. So I wanted these needs and assumption to just be there as anchor points for the future discussion we're going to have. That's my introduction.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo, and simple slides. Thank you very much for the good points made. And now we'll turn to Mr. Randy Willis. He's a member of the RPAS panel for CANSO. Randy.
Great, thank you, Chris. I have a few thought slides for that, but as with most panels, the interaction, the question and answer session is usually the best. So I'll do my best to step through here and give you some things to think about. So one of the things I thought about is, like, what does actual flight rules enable today, right? What are they enabling? So they enable a safe environment. They allow dissimilar aircraft to operate in the same airspace. They're there today. They provide proper airspace management, predictability, standardization, and then to some degree they offer and enable public acceptance with it too. So what is the problem or lenses? What are the needs, right? Identify them, or what are our gaps between what we have today for manned aviation and what we're trying to achieve and to enable for UAS activities and operations to take place? Are they technology? Are they policy gaps? Are they regulatory gaps that exist? Or are they all three that's there? And also identify, make comparisons. Is VFR IFR, is that the same as visual line of sight and beyond visual line of sight? A lot of people want to think so. Beyond visual line of sight is often referred to as IFR flight. With that piece, is it? And from a regulatory discussion from that. And a lot of discussion been happening concerning contingency operations, both with the airframe and also the system that supports the activities from that. So some considerations for moving forward and for conversation is to, I believe the desire is to integrate and normalize UAS operations in all classes of airspace from out there. And also the need to actually support standard creation organizations. Shout out for you there, Phil, with the ASTM. And identify the rulemaking efforts early. They do not take, they're not short. They take a long time. And to identify them early and to prioritize them appropriately and then actually execute the process to complete them. Continue the discussions and maturation on contingency management. And also at the bottom there, CANSO certainly advocates collaborating, coordinating with all stakeholders in order to move the conversation forward. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Randy. So we'll get right into it. Thank you very much for your initial thoughts. Olivier, is it necessary to change the existing rules?
Well, as you said rightfully in the introduction, the rules are very flexible. These rules of the air, as they are in Annex 2, they are from the 50s. And if you look at the volume compared to other documents, it's very, very small, because it's high level and it's flexible and it respects the liability and the freedom of state authorities to accommodate the rules and the principles as needed. And I believe from the very beginning, this is something that should inspire us in the reflection, first, using the existing rules, using the existing flexibility, and see how this flexibility allows us to accommodate the standards that would be defined by the industry and the needs expressed by this industry in the context that would be feasible if we consider the need to share the same airspace with manned aviation.
Thanks for that. And Philip, on the same point, why can't the current flight rules and procedures simply be applied across the board for these emerging technologies? Why do we have to harmonise the procedures in New Zealand and Poland?
Well, I'm not going to answer the question about why you have to harmonise them between the countries, but that's a later question. But to the first point, I think the rules were developed to be all-encompassing, pretty much. But they were designed for specific airspace, specific operations, and for specific equipment. And with this disruptive technology now coming into more common use, I think you have to take a look at and decide whether or not you can apply the rules that were developed 40, 50 years ago to new technologies that are taking advantage of automation, taking people out of the cockpits. And again, back to Lorenzo's point about the needs. Take a look at the specific new needs and see whether or not we have to adapt the regulations and the rules to fit the current environment and the current technologies.
Lorenzo, you spoke in your presentation about assumptions. What are the underlying assumptions behind the need for new flight rules?
Yeah, that's to me a key question, because if you look at what's going on today, what is currently stressing the system, with trying to approve BVLOS operation over urban environments, that even if are flying below 400 feet or 500 feet are sharing the airspace with police helicopter, rescue helicopters, and we are doing that basically by exception. We are putting a lot of operational restrictions over these operations because we do not have a way to integrate them from a flight rules perspective. So we need to start there. I think the assumption is that we're going to have mixed traffic, that the idea that you can segregate all the unmanned and the manned in two different worlds doesn't apply, and therefore you need to have rules that allow both to coexist in the same airspace. You can start below 500 feet, urban environment, and then the next channel will be UAM. So you may be tricked in saying, let's start just below 400 feet, there is no manned aviation, but when the rule comes out, UAM will be there, and they will not fly below 500 feet, right? So the assumption has to be that these new rules also have to be able to deal with UAM, urban air mobility, in airspace where pretty much everybody can be, right? That's one thing. The second thing is automation. You know, you need to have an assumption that we're going to regulate with these flight rules automatic and or autonomous aircrafts, that there is no pilot, that there could be fleets managed by a single operator, and that you need to be able to deal with that, right? And there is no single pilot for a single aircraft and so on and so forth. This is the reality out there. And so if we don't make these strong assumptions right now, we're going to go in the wrong direction, developing rules that in 5 years will not be useful. That's I think, very important.
It just occurs to me that when we have this discussion, we might be talking in a vacuum, and you talk about operations below 500 feet. Can I just ask how many helicopter pilots there are in the room, please? One. So you represent all helicopter pilots of the globe. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. We'll be looking for questions from you. We have another one as well. Oh, congratulations. That's excellent. There does a need, I'm assuming, Lorenzo, that to determine these assumptions, there needs to be a wide consultation. Going on to Randy, and I'm just finding your question. What are some of the challenges or barriers to creating and implementing new flight rules for UAS?
Right. So I can relate back to Lorenzo's discussion. One, you need to have a solid base and a solid understanding before you can move forward with that. Also identified in previous, I think Olivia had one in there concerning identifying the requirements piece. So there's many elements that are needed in order to move forward and to create or even identify whether a new flight rule is needed. I think some of the biggest ones that I've seen and have experienced is one, the public piece, the public acceptance piece, and also identifying the right level of regulation in order to maintain safety, but also enable the activity. Finding that right piece of harmonization between there is really key. And many states have various ways to do regulations and put them out, but consultation usually is the way that most of them take place. But so, I mean, I don't think there's one true one that really stands out. There's a lot that actually has to come into play in order for regulations to become reality.
Is ICAO already behind? I'm just thinking back to when the RPAS panel put out some, or when they were prioritizing standards for RPAS, and the priorities was approval processes and those sorts of things that needed to be dealt with immediately, airworthiness issues. Is there something that we need to do immediately with respect to flight rules? Because I presume we can do things in a phased manner. Anyone can take this question.
Sure, I'll start. So I do have a bias. I'll put that out first. I have a bias to the RPAS panel. I think the work that's taking place there is actually is ahead. So the scope and the operations that are there, those operations are very limited at this time. International IFR, those are not occurring a whole lot. So the SARPs and the PANs that are being created out of the RPAS panel are being put in place to actually lead the activities and lead the industry towards regulatory requirements.
Thank you. And just as Olivier, you're taking and answering this question, and can you also speak to the short-term options available until UAS can apply the rules of the air?
This one first?
Either.
Yeah, no, just to complement what was said before, I fully support the idea to do a step-by-step approach and to think of safety first. It cannot be a big bang in any way. And we must also keep in mind that in the existing rules, there are tools that can be used to accommodate almost any kind of activities like it has been done in the decades before for the military or others. And this can be used as a readily available tool and take the necessary time to develop safe rules for longer-term integration. And that's in fact, the point, the response as well to the second question, question that you asked, which is about the short-term solution. Yes, I know that a number of people do not like the term segregation, but we should not take it again to the letter. The word is hiding different concepts. It may be segregation by airspace management. It may be segregation by procedure management. It may be segregation in time or operational or tactical type of separating the different traffics which are not compatible. And I believe in the very short term, until we have stable requirements, that's the best tools to be used.
Thank you. And just working from that point, Philip, current regulators struggle in terms of their budget to provide regulation for traditional means of air transport. What do you think the key challenges are that are facing industry and regulators with respect to flight rules?
Well, outside of the fact that there may be a little confusion on what steps they need to take to comply, I think with the changing technologies that are involved, if the industry is not, if there aren't regulation rules enable this new industry to actually get into the airspace, if they feel cut out, then there's no way they're going to be able to expand future operations and learn more about how to fit into the specific airspace.
Thank you. And Lorenzo, in the collaborative world that we work in now, where many different operator wants a piece of the airspace, wants to share the airspace, how do you include the notion of fairness or equitable access to airspace when designing new rules?
Yeah, this is the next big one. Anyway, I had the privilege to join some of the work that is going on in the UTM working group in the ASTM, and in attempting to define algorithms that are able to, for example, strategically deconflict operations, even just before takeoff. Every step of the way, the question is, how do we make sure that this decision is actually fair? Now, imagine that you have an airspace with thousands of aircraft, right? And they're all strategically deconflicted by an algorithm that is taking decisions on who goes where, go up, go down. How do you make sure that these decisions are actually fair? How do you make sure as a regulator that if the person that has been sent down comes to me and says, I'm treated unfairly because I'm always sent down and I make more noise, and the citizen complain about my noise, and the other guy is sent up and he doesn't make any noise, so I don't like that. And the guy that goes up comes to you and complains that he's using more fuel every time because he needs to go up, and your algorithm is basically giving him trouble. I'm a regulator. How am I going to say you are right or you're wrong, right? So these decisions have to be made with some notion of fairness attached to them that is audible and clearly understandable. And I think that this is going to be a big amount of work when you try to tackle flight rules that are done in an algorithmic way. Of course, if there is a human in the loop, you have the same problem, but it's not as dramatic as if these rules apply for automation. So I think that I've seen already some papers coming out already discussing fairness. I've seen the discussion again happening in ASTM. And I don't think, that was my feedback, by the way, due to the group, is I don't think that we can leave this discussion to industry only. So yes, ASTM or others could do the work, but this is a discussion that has to involve the regulators, because externalities of the system, like noise, for example, public acceptance, is something that the regulator has to take into account. And so this really has to be a conversation between the two worlds, and it cannot be left to industry to say, do a standard that defines fairness, and we are happy with it. That's not going to work. So I think that's how you do it, start to collaborate.
So you think the two helicopter pilots in the room have a place in this discussion?
Absolutely, yes. That's
very good,
absolutely,
very good.
yes. Even if there are only two, but one of them I know very well, it's good, so you can count.
Now, I actually find that this session talking about flight rules is a wee bit of a misnomer. It's almost like grabbing one sentence out of all international civil aviation and say what you're going to do about this. But can we really talk about flight rules without talking about service provision? Can we talk about flight rules without talking about airspace classification? So I ask you, is there any priority? Should we be looking at airspace classification first? What are some of the priorities that we should be looking at for harmonization globally? Because from my perspective, from ICAO, I'm only here because we need standardization globally. I don't really care what goes on in part of Poland, quite frankly, and they're a sovereign state. They can often do whatever they want to do. So what are the priorities in terms of service provision that actually will make us determine what kind of flight rules would be necessary? I might have thrown them on this.
That's a good question, Chris. So one, I don't have the full answer, but I have some thoughts. So I would agree with you. Everything is connected. The system was built that way and it's grown that way, where one part moves, another part moves with it, or moves in the opposite direction because of the movement, and there's fairness built into it. But in order to move forward, I mean, you have to have a very concise thought. The conversations with creating UTM to this point have been really fantastic for that part. I think it's time now to really start focusing and targeting specific areas inside this ecosystem that's being proposed, and take them and start developing them and moving them forward so they have a better understanding and or identify if more maturation or more understanding needs to take place, or more research behind it for that part. I think there's a tremendous amount of energy and a lot of great ideas that's been brought forth in the last 5 or 6 years of this discussion. But I think it's time now to really move and target areas to move forward. I was actually inspired by the conversation yesterday concerning remote ID. That's a key element inside this ecosystem that needs to be developed and understood, and for everybody to gain acceptance and move forward. There's many other elements inside to make this ecosystem work. We need to start prioritizing and identifying them and actually working them to fruition.
Yeah, just to add to that, as far as how to tackle the problem, I don't think boiling the ocean all at once is the right approach, or trying to swallow the whole elephant. I think we got to take a piece of it. I think the first piece would obviously be tackling UTM and figuring out how that's all going to work and fit into the larger ecosystem. And then a lot of folks had previously been talking about separating UTM from ATM. And I don't think anybody here thinks that's going to work. There's going to be overlap, especially with the area of UAM as well. So I think you have to crawl, walk, run, so to speak, but tackling the issues that Lorenzo was talking about first in UTM will help feed knowledge and learn how to start tackling UAM, and then figuring out how that's going to tie into the whole ecosystem.
Okay, understood. So here in ICAO, we're only permitted to develop and adopt standards that are mature and stable. And so the probable applicability date that I could imagine that would be suitable for this particular subject, I would say, if we were good, 2026. And that's where, with 2026, we'd be coming forward to ICAO with provisions in the next 18 months to 2 years. So what would you say at the moment is mature, ready for standardization in terms of flight rules? Anybody? It's good if there's nothing, because I'm busy with a whole lot of other stuff. So, it's not a problem. But where should we be focused? What's the industry screaming for at the moment that will help them? Because they're asking for harmonization because it saves them a fortune.
But you made an assumption that we can only do what is stable and mature, right? So I was on a panel yesterday where the conclusion was slightly different, meaning that's the way it used to be. But if you look at the way remote ID was developed and eventually maybe recognized in the future in some way, shape, or form from ICAO, the conclusion yesterday panel was maybe this different way of working is something that we need to start looking into, and it is we go bottom up. So the industry, the authorities around the world, they do something, and even if it is not 100% mature, even if it is an 85% solution, if there is global consensus around that solution, like it looks to be for remote ID, maybe it's time also to start looking into that and say maybe we could standardize this product in a way that could be different from the way we know, I don't know, but that's a different process. And this is the way it works when you look at anything that is digital. That's the way software is, everything works like that. Now, clearly, you have the problem with safety, you have the problem with the time, with iteration time, you have the problem. There are several challenges in trying to change the way you do things, but I would say that it's from yesterday's panel's conclusion, I think that that's the way we need to go. Because if we wait for this to be stable and requirements to be stable for something that comes out in 2026, then we will always be behind, right? And that's the question is, how do you allow operation? How do you enable if you're always behind? That's kind of a challenge. So I think the remote ID example is perfect to see how you could flip it around and be in time.
Yes, and of course, I think, and just before you speak, of course, the rules over the high seas apply without exception. So that might be an area which is a priority, recognizing sovereign states can do as they wish as their sovereign authority under the convention. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then turning things around in 10 years, I don't think is going to work in this environment anymore. I mean, industry is very nimble, and I think the regulators have to be a little bit more nimble as well. And that's not to say that the ICAO rules need to be changed, but on a more granular level, at a sovereign level, a national level, there's no reason why they can't start adjusting, their flight rules specific to UTM, UAM as well. And as far as the safety piece goes, I would say that things that are going into UAM, like negotiation and priority protocols, are safety because they would provide some sort of rigor to a traffic management system. And I think people knowing what they have to do, even in a UTM system, could support safe operations as well.
And Olivier, where do you think the most challenging issues are in the short term?
Well, in my view, and this is partially related to what was said before, it's probably the question of integration of manned and unmanned. Because talking about standards and quick reaction of developing them, again, as I said before, using the existing tools to develop activities at a fast pace in a restricted airspace can be done. If you do that quickly, it means later when you want to integrate these specific activities with the normal aviation, you have to think of adapting both, the new one that you created and the old one. Another option is to go little by little towards directly integration, but of course it takes more time. And that's where I see one of the biggest challenges, integration of manned and unmanned, because they obey to different objectives, different methodologies, different rules, different capabilities. And this is definitely something which has to be looked at and decisions to be made accordingly, whether it's the priority to be given to quick development of a new activity or compatibility with the old one.
Okay, and let's think a wee bit further into the future, or I'm not sure where it is, but I'm talking about algorithmic solutions or rules. Lorenzo, how do we naturally shift from a human-centric set of rules to something that's algorithmic? Are we there yet?
Again, if I look at what these guys are doing, yes. We are there. We are developing algorithms to do strategic deconfliction. The next time you're going to develop them to do dynamic deconfliction, which means this is happening while you're flying, and those algorithms are going to decide where you're going to fly. And this is happening now. It's not happening in 5 years or in 10 years. It's happening right now in your group. And the development is not done by random people, crazy. This is Amazon, Google, Uber, Airbus, these are companies that are planning to fly tomorrow and that they see the problem and they are trying to address it. So the shift is already happening. at that level, so the industry is already aware that we have an issue, that we cannot wait for the man to tell me go left, go right. That's not going to happen anymore. The shift is happening. So from their point of view, they are working on the change. The big question is, how are we regulators from, let's say, from member states all the way up to ICAO going to deal with it? It's because this is not something that you can improvise. You know, the knowledge that you need as a regulator to understand what is going on in these groups, just to be able to talk with them, it's a completely different environment. It's a complete new world. It's IT, it's digitalization. So for us to be able to interact with those players in a meaningful way, it's a challenge by itself. To regulate that is even worse. So that's why I think the pressure, many people are putting pressure on regulators, is not much because we need the rule like today, but it's because people know that regulators will need quite some time to catch up. And if we don't start now, basically we will be the bottleneck for the industry, because they are starting already. So I think the challenge, the key is regulators engage, go deal with these problems, go and understand algorithms, understand how that can impact your life as a regulator. Maybe your new rules of the air is not a book, it's a GitHub piece of software. Who knows? But if you don't engage, you never know. So that's my plea, we need to engage as regulators. The sooner the better.
Are we seeing an improvement in that engagement? Are we seeing regulators talking to regulators more commonly? Are they traveling to each other's country, learning from each other?
I would say some regulators do, yes.
Okay. We'll leave that one. So then we move on to autonomy and autonomous flight and flight rules. Are they compatible? Philip, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's where, I don't want to say the issue started, but, unmanned flight, it's generally going to be autonomous, and manned flight is becoming more autonomous. So are they compatible? It's going to have to be compatible, because that's the wave of the future. And to Lorenzo's points, algorithmic solutions are going to have to play into that. So the more the regulators become engaged with what industry is doing now to solve those problems, I think the better we're going to get to the end state that we want to be. But the question is, are they compatible? I don't think they may not yet be compatible, but they're going to have to be compatible for these new emerging technologies to succeed.
And Randy, two questions for you. One, how are you seeing the collaboration between ATS providers evolve on this particular subject? But more, tell me, is there some areas that more research and development needs to be done before we come to any sort of conclusions?
Certainly. Well, I think in just a few presentations that we've had today, the involvement of the ANSP and air traffic was vital to this success of the operation. So I am seeing there's much more involvement today. The regulators are working with and bringing in the ANSPs for discussion and to assist with airspace matters and how best fit an operation into an existing environment that's already there and been established for many years. From that's where the technical knowledge lies. So that's a resource that should be used, and I believe it is being used more in order to enable the operations to move forward. And the second part of your question, Chris, was what?
Are there specific areas where we need to do a little bit more research and development before we come to any conclusions at all?
I would say, the easy answer to that is certainly yes.
Be specific.
To be the specific part, I would say, let's prioritize what we need first, right? Do we need to take the proposed notional system, right, and then research and develop that piece, or do we need to take specific elements of a notional system to ensure that the safety, the reliability levels inside that system are met to a certain degree before we can move forward. Talking about the deconfliction management and the separation piece inside that part, that's a real good area for exploration and understanding better what's appropriate. Is it 5 meters or is it 50 meters? What's the appropriate distance between them? What's the safe distance, and what will enable the activities to move forward?
Yeah, thank you for that. Now, of course, we've had this assumption that when we desegregate this airspace, that well, the easiest way is that all RPAS, as an example, will comply with all the existing rules, and then we're good. That's not normally the way things happen. Do you think the existing traditional traffic in the future environment needs to accept that there will be some changes necessary in their part of the world as well to come to this party of all of them using this single resource?
Yeah, I think we're actually seeing that now. Many states have implemented rules to address small UAS flight in various airspaces. And I'm already seeing and understanding that manned aviation are completely aware of the new aviators that are out there, where they're flying, how they're flying, and the altitudes that they're flying in to some degree, as long as the regulations stipulate an altitude associated with it. So I think that's already happening today, and it will certainly be a part of moving forward and into the future. It will be integrated, as we say, but there's always accommodation that takes place. Not every airplane that flies in our airspace today are completely integrated into the airspace. There's accommodations there. They're flying in the airspace where they can't perform all the rules and expectations that are there. Some can't do specific turns, right? Some can't have certain equipage associated with them, but they're accommodated in the system and provided services today.
Thank you for that. There are certain subjects that are being dealt with by ICAO at the moment that sort of have nothing to do with drones or RPAS because they're general to all aviation. Cyber resilience, development of a new flight planning system that we're doing called FFICE. Can you tell me about some of the dependencies that you're dependent upon that's sort of not exactly related to drones, UAS or RPAS, that you feel that if there isn't sufficient progress in this other world, then it's not going to take off anyway?
I'll take the first hit. Yeah, so with FFICE, so I think that's important for that to develop. FFICE, the way I understand it, provides the greater flexibility and understanding of the flight itself that would take place. Current flight plan is limited to 18 fields, specific amount of characters associated with it, and certain things to go in certain boxes. FFICE is going to allow the opportunity to expand in a lot of these areas. I know, so Block 18, the regular flight plan, the remarks section, a lot of the UAS operations and information is being provided in there. FFICE be able to provide additional information, whether it's point of contact information back to the remote pilot station, to have direct communications with them that way or whatever, but FFICE certainly needs to move forward and to help enable the UAS community.
Yeah, to a certain extent with FFICE, in relation to service provision, you may not need new flight rules. It's just that you will have the information and you'll know how to provide a service in relation to that equipage.
Yeah, good point. Yes, concur.
Yeah. And a good example of that could be, for example, the pre-programmed procedures in case of C2 link loss, for which item 18 of the flight plan currently would not be appropriate, but with all these new tools, that could definitely cover the need.
Any other subjects that drones will be dependent upon, but it's really being developed outside of the drone world because it's so universal?
Can I be a bit provocative? I think
absolutely.
No, just saying that. I mean, the drones are not going to be dependent on something. If it comes too late, they're just going to veer on something else. That's the way it works. So if you look at, for example, flight planning and all of that, again, if the assumption is that I have an NSP that is managing that, and that assumption holds, then yes, we are dependent on that. However, if I switch to UTM, where I have multiple service providers that are offering services and potentially managing, for example, the deconfliction of strategic deconfliction, they need flight plans as well, right? But they were going to share them in a completely different way. They're going to share them using standards that, again, are being developed right now, and therefore this dependency is no longer there. So you go back to the assumption, right? If the assumption is that we keep the existing system as it is, then yes, you have dependencies. But if the industry is changing it, well, then you need to look into, okay, what is the change going to do to the existing system? So it's bidirectional, the challenge. And I don't think that the industry, as I see it today, is so eager to wait. I think the pressure is on, the power is on, and they have the means to change the system if the system doesn't adapt to them. And I think we need to consider that as regulators. That's the nature of disruption. That's what disruption actually is. So if we are in presence of it, we need to be aware.
So there have been circumstances in the past where there have been thoughts of developing new flight rules, and I just think about visual flight rules where there was an appreciation across the globe that those rules were not suitable, and so they developed something called controlled VFR, and in another circumstance they have special VFR. Do you think there's the flexibility in the industry to recognize that they have to work within some of the existing terminology of international rules so that it actually makes it a little bit easier? Let me just give you an example. If you had a new flight rules called E-rules or something rather like that, that means you would have to change the flight plan. You want to change the flight plan, that means everyone will have to change their flight data processing system throughout the world. This is kind of a complication that may not be necessary. Is there flexibility within the industry to understand those sorts of difficulties in providing international rules?
I think as a whole, in every aspect, industry is very flexible. And if it will help them get to the endpoint they want to get, commercialization of unmanned systems as well, I think they can be very flexible and they can adopt and be adaptable to many circumstances. I find regulators are trying to be flexible as well. I think they're a little bit more constrained, though, than our industry partners.
We're just coming to the end of our session now, and so as a question that I often ask in these sorts of situations, we're a specialized agency of the UN. We have our difficulties in communicating to the wider community, but I notice with this particular subject, these kinds of symposia, these kinds of ways of communicating with the wider community is a bit of a change for ICAO. Are there other areas where ICAO can communicate better with the community or speed up the process by which we can actually develop those early provisions that will become necessary? Have you got any suggestions on how ICAO can improve? Normally we'd have this discussion with a couple of beers, but really we have to do this sober.
I think this is a good venue for it, and I think the drone enables that you've done, it gives the industry the opportunity to come in and talk about what they're doing, and that's the way that you can get feedback. I would suggest coming to some of the, not just ASTM, but a lot of the standards organizations. They have some of the leading folks in unmanned systems developing standards based on the technologies current available and the technologies expected in the future. And I would invite ICAO representatives to see what's going on down in the working groups in the pits to see what they're doing. And I think that'd be a good way to get feedback as well. And I'm not just talking about ASTM. There's a lot of good work being done in the SDOs.
So having the opportunity to work with the RPAS team here at ICAO for the last 8 years, if ICAO believes it's a priority, then resource it appropriately to hold and continue facilitations for UAS activities, to be the global voice, to be the global leader, to provide venues like this and provide venues that's provided with the UAS advisory group to move them forward, to bring ideas, to have technical experts there to advise and give information to help move the conversation forward. I think that would be my statement.
Well, by coincidence, I hold the purse strings of ICAO, so I can make that happen. So thank you very much. It's a good suggestion.
Yes, sure.
Closing comments. Where do you see the international world in terms of flight rules globally in 5 years' time?
Well, 5 years' time is kind of short in this world, but I think they're going to have to adapt to the current the technologies that are going to be around today, starting to be around today, and going to be here in 5 years. So right now, most of the UAS operations are within sovereign states, but you can expect operations to be going across borders, whether it's air transport, environmental surveys, et cetera. I think ICAO's got to be ready to address those and adapt to that changing environment.
Olivia?
Yeah, I believe there is a lot of benefits to derive from intense communication between the industry and rule-making authorities, because none of them can achieve the progress individually, and only with good cooperation between these two types of instances we will be able to derive the necessary stability that will allow a step-by-step progress of the environment and the regulations that go with it.
Thank you. Randy?
Yeah, so I think we'll see some small wins in the next 5 years. I'm not sure if we'll see an environment where we have multiple UTM ecosystems in place. I think we'll be closer, and there will be some isolated areas that will have these systems in place, and they'll be operating and doing well. But I think in 5 years is probably too quick, but I do see some small wins in that time frame.
Provocative, Lorenzo?
Yeah, I stopped thinking 5 years, because every time I do, I make a mistake. Now I look at the next 6 months and see how it goes. That's how fast it goes.
Oh my KO, I say 15.
Yeah, I know.
Years.
That's the challenge. It's really a challenge when we do planning, when we even for our concept of operation for UTM and all of that. You try to do it in 1 year, 2 years, and then the industry comes with new technology, new ideas, new concept, and you have to redo it again. So for me, I change my mind now, and I try to be as flexible as possible. And then I go with the flow, because the flow you cannot control. So the only thing you can do is to be flexible and to be able to fail and pivot when the industry comes with new ideas, new technologies, new concepts. So for me, the evolution will be, it's very difficult to predict, because it's not linear, it's not static, it's very difficult. And I only recommend, from my side to myself and to everybody, to try and be flexible, to put together, frameworks, policies that are as flexible as possible, so that you don't have to do it again and again and again every time that this changes, because it will continue to change. And that's the only thing that is certain. So.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to finish this session, because before thanking you, I want to thank the people who wrote the first drafts of Annex 2 and Annex 11 that talked about these subjects and built in that flexibility. And something must have been going on in their head to say, you know what, maybe things will change. I don't know. How about we give a bit of flexibility and allow the ATS authority to make some decisions in certain areas where it's not going to impact the need for global harmonization necessarily. So thank you to them, but also thank you to you, gentlemen. It was a very, very enjoyable session, and it was eye-opening, and you gave different perspectives. Very much appreciated. Can you put your hands together to thank the panel? Thank you very much. Now, if I remember rightly, there's no break, right? We go straight on to the summing up. You want to go ahead? I'll let you do it.
Cool. Thank you, Chris, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for these excellent discussions. At this time, as we have done during our previous drone-enabled symposia, we will have a recap session with all the moderators of the previous sessions to discuss the key messages that were heard this week. So this change will take place as soon as the group picture here on stage is completed, which should happen shortly.
Always a pleasure.
Aviation Bureau at ICAO. Please help me welcome Mr. Steve Creamer and his panel.
Thank you. As you can see, we're a little less formal up here by the end of the symposium, and for all of you who are still with us, you all get gold stars for endurance after 3 very packed days of activities. And so we're going to follow a format which, if you've been at Drone Enable, is familiar, and we'll do a recap by panel of the material that was covered in the words of each of the moderators. We'll let each of them speak in turn. There will be some words on the screen which may or may not perfectly align with the narrative that you hear. That's okay, because we've actually asked them, use that as a starting point, and then please personalize this to the recollection that they have. If you have any comments that you'd like to feed back to us, remember plenary_1@icao.int. I will be reading for any email questions that we may receive, and we'll feed that back in if we have a chance. But as we go through this, it's really a chance to just recollect and refresh on all of the material that we've heard over the past couple of days, and maybe make some threads tie together between the different points that are raised on some key overarching issues. So I'm going to start by talking about the opening very briefly. We did an opening where we talked about what ICAO is doing. Of course, we have a panel on remote piloted aircraft systems. We've got the Unmanned Aircraft System Advisory Group, which has industry and state members who are advising ICAO, and frankly, were very instrumental in the development of the agenda for this symposium and the last 2, Drone Enable. The Model UAS regulations, which have just been published for utilization by states who are in the beginnings of trying to regulate activity in their own environment. The humanitarian guidelines for use of UAS in humanitarian assistance and in disaster relief kinds of activities. Discussion around how 1090 and ADS-B may have applicability in the UAS world without necessarily infringing upon the usefulness of the network for the manned aviation community. And so there's some discussion there. And of course, we had a briefing on the Aircraft Registry Network, which is not, as we briefed previously, about ICAO owning all of the registration data on the global civil aviation fleet, but instead finding a way for a federation of registries that the states essentially operate, or perhaps industry in some cases, that could be interactive and interchangeable. So that's That was the recap on the beginning of day one. And then we had a brief and a panel on the Global Aviation Trust Framework. And I'll ask Bill Voss to take that and walk through it for now. Bill?
All right. Thanks, Steve. Let's see. Slides coming up.
We need to drive the slide to the next slide, please.
That's okay. I'll just start talking anyway.
Go one
All
more.
right.
Boom.
Oh, there we go.
There
Something
we
like
go.
that.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry.
Yeah, so had a great panel. I'll try to summarize my summary of the trust framework. I mean, we really talked about the fact that we have a emergency almost digitization of the existing aviation system. It's happening very, very quickly with a big business imperative. At the same time, we've got a business imperative to accommodate a whole bunch of entrants who are born digital. They don't have to become digital. And the trick of this is to take a look at this whole thing and realize, identify at least, the bits that we all have in common and take common and efficient approaches to those things. And the real conclusion is this idea of identity and trust. Trusted identity is a big deal, and trusted identity is also tied to international law and the convention. That's good news. We've got a basis to work from. And so we talked about the value of that, about how we could actually make a trusted, highly trusted identity, partly by building on top of that regulatory oversight that already exists as part of the framework. And so we had some great discussions. We heard from the FAA representing the traditional systems on the ground now and talked about the imperative that exists there as we have to come off the old antique lines and we have to build a system that can scale. Because what we have now doesn't scale. It's point by point, agreement by agreement, end to end. And then after we understood the business imperative there, we heard from Boeing and the fact that it isn't just about drones. It isn't just about the old stuff. It's about all the things in the middle. Big airplanes need identities too. I think we can say we got out of that. And that there is a real pressing need. And there'll be a real pressing need as well when you start getting into things like urban air mobility and so on. Then we started moving into UTM, hearing from Gutma. And something very important happened. We made a lot of tiebacks to the previous presentation on the idea of an interoperable registry, because that's really at the core of this. You can have a trusted identification, but you have to have a way for that to move so that it can be recognized. And a registry is part of that. And Ronaldo was kind enough to raise his hand on behalf of industry and say that industry is looking forward to working with ICAO on working out some of those sticky issues about federation. And that was a great, great outcome. And of course, we went to Christian from DJI, who is probably the purest of the digital people on the stage, a totally digital world. And we started talking there about things like manufacturer codes and so on. And again, registries, about how all of this ties together. And so I think the real summary of the panel is that we talked about the fact we have common interests, we have common problems, and we don't necessarily have to diverge. We can converge onto common and efficient solutions that strengthen the integrity of the system and cut costs for people at the same time. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Bill. So one of the things I'm hearing from what you said, and I think we're gonna run into it in a couple of the other panels, is we have a lot of different stakeholder communities who are finding they have similar needs for the progression of their industry or for their use case, which may have common elements. And one of our challenges is knowing that, just so that we all can grow, not in serial, but kind of like parallel, but sharing information. So thank you for raising that for me. The next panel was information management. Jean-Francois Groth, the Assistant Director of ICAO Relations at IATA, was leading that panel. Jean-Francois?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So several speakers, provided views on what a potential information architecture could look like, and it included a flight information management system that would act as an enabler to transfer information between the different actors. And it was interesting to see, that there will be more automation involved than what we know today in man aviation. And I think that was stressed, in the panel that just finished. And we also saw that there will be more actors, that will need to have access to information. And more information will also be required than what we know today because of the sum of those new requirements. And in addition, following a question which was interesting, it was also mentioned that some of the existing, information domain like AIM, would have to evolve if we want to address, all the needs of those new communities. But let's say to finish on the information management session, there was some good news with the fact that some of the presenters, were showing that they were already, considering using system-wide information management that ICAO, is about to standardize to support exchange of information both inside the UTM domain, but also between UTM and ATM. And to me, that's good news that we can, find bridges, between those new communities and the existing man aviation. And the last point, I think, was made in some of the presentation is the fact that there are already a lot of standards that can be reused, and we should benefit from that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jean-Francois. So we after the day one, we split into two streams to review the presentations that were selected in the request for information. And those streams were broken out into a series of panels. The first panel was the UTM service suppliers organizational construct and approval processes. Carlos Cirillo, the director of the ATM infrastructure at IATA, was moderating that panel. Carlos?
Thank you, Steve. I struggle with the title as well.
Me too.
It's long. So, and thanks for those who provide the answer for the RFI. Not only the presentation, but also the papers, if you can allow the papers to be available for everyone. They're very good. We have a very different, I think, broad presentation from the traditional ATM. One with the ANSP being the provider for the USS, to the other stream where we have a totally federated system. Some of you could see that they have benefits and challenges on each of those solutions. I think we didn't have any agreement within the group and not within the discussions that anyone is better than the other. They're different. And it will be dependent on the situation, on the environment, on the actors that are playing on that specific environment, which one is going to be more fitted for their proposal. One thing was very clear, and it's highlighted that in the slide, is interoperability is crucial. Interoperability will make it easier, less complex, and it's going to be heavily dependent on global standards. We need to be talking about the same, we'll be understanding the same, regardless the way it's implemented. Another thing that was important we discussed is the necessity to include the community. We have been talking between us, between the aviation industry. We need to engage the community as well, because they will be part of the users of the system. So it's important to hear the say. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Carlos. So at the same time Carlos was moderating this panel on the UTM, next door we were talking about deconfliction and separation management. Randy Willis, who's a key member of the RPAS panel and now with CANSO, was moderating that group. Randy?
Hey, thanks, Steve. Certainly. So we had a really good group of people. So we had academia, we had some researchers, and we had some organizations that are looking and exploring and looking at business cases to implement UTM from different perspectives. I think we had some really good presentations, some issues that's actually been in discussion for a while, but has not ever made it to this level of discussion and seen in public and discussed in public. So we had an individual that brought forth a known issue between GPS altitude and barometric altitude, and the discussion on that, and presented the analysis and the research that was conducted on that. I think that was very, very good, and really showing maturity in the whole UTM discussion, identifying the tough topics, the tough issues to address, and help bring them forward for discussion and move them. We had discussion concerning different types of systems and the algorithms and the role they'll play, and how they may play and adjust speed and perhaps altitude for deconfliction, and the cooperative environment that they'll work in, and the software and that will take to make it work and put in place and be reliable on a basis. We touched on contingency management just a little bit inside of it, since it wasn't the true focus, but it seems like it's always mixed in with the discussion. It ensures that the safety that addresses there. One of the other things that I'd call out that was, I'd call it a first, is that we had just a tiny bit of discussion on cost. Right. So what might you charge, or what is the charge for the service that's being provided there? And I thought that was a good mature move forward to have that, because the expectation is to truly have it free is not really a true expectation. So the cost did enter our conversation just a little.
Okay, thanks, Randy. I want to share just an insight I had watching somebody fly a drone for the first time who's a pilot. And when it comes to this conversation about deconfliction and separation management, we all think in terms of vehicles that when they take off, they're moving, right? They're kind of like a shark in the water. You always have to deal with that. And this person was playing with a drone and recognizing for the first time that when they just stopped doing anything, the drone just sat still. You know, it sat at the same altitude, and it stopped, and it waited for something else to happen. And that's a new feature in deconflicting and separation with these that a traditional air traffic management person doesn't necessarily take on board on their own. So I think all of this experience with how things work in these new environments is really going to be important for us. And as you said, this difference between baro and GPS or GNSS altitude. So thank you. We came back together after the lunch break yesterday, and then we started working on risk assessment and models and contingency operations. And for that conversation, Mr. Chris Dalton, the Chief of Airspace Management and the Optimization at ICAO, moderated that panel. Chris?
Thank you, Steve. And it's a very interesting panel, quite a complex subject. Risk management is critical. Safety comes first. In ATM, or the traditional ATM, human is central to the mitigation or to mitigate risks. But what about UTM? It was clear that there's challenges still to calculate ground risk and air risk. There's a lack of data, and there's some dynamic aspects that are quite difficult to handle at this stage. But UTM does mitigate risks in addition to some methodologies, and we had some nice presentations on Sora and Medusa. There's, of course, this traditional view remains that there are pre-flight aspects to risk mitigation in terms of threat identification, strategic conflict management, and then in flight we have the tactical deconfliction, collision avoidance, and such like, and then finally we have contingency and emergency procedures, which the procedures may not remain standardized. Maybe in future there needs to be a more dynamic approach to that. Data exchange is seen as fundamental, and clearly there's a large number, quite significant research and development projects on this subject, and it was agreed ICAO involvement is needed, and there is a need for global guidance. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. After that, in the afternoon yesterday, we had a discussion on industry successes. We had a panel, we had a demonstration, which in and of itself demonstrated the foibles of development. But at the same time, I think it very clearly demonstrated needs being addressed by the industry in a way that is really important. And that could not have been a successful progression without this multi-organizational collaboration of all types, the manufacturers, network providers, the regulatory community, and law enforcement even. and talking about how we can create products that meet an end goal or an end need. We've heard before about the trust framework, we've heard about the aircraft registration network, and we've come to recognize that for low altitude operations, particularly in an urban environment, with the security and privacy issues that come with that, it's going to be really important that we have a way to identify the utilization, who's utilizing a drone and what characteristics that operation has. And so there were two variations applied to this industry standard that is about to be published from ASTM on remote ID, both network ID and broadcast ID. Now, we heard a little bit of debate about, what's the best way to do that, but that's not the important part. What's important is that we also heard about the common elements of both services and how those common elements, because of the dialogue throughout the industry, they got combined into the same standard for different products and different outcomes. Both have been very robustly tested, and in the opinion of the people who have been doing the testing and development, it's ready for that version 1 deployment and consideration by the regulators around the world to begin to incorporate into their regulatory processes. So it's not the end state, it's the beginning. And Chris, in just the last panel, talked about the ICAO framework of, we think 15 years to develop something. That's not the way this is going to progress. By the 15th year, we'll probably be at version 10, right? That would be the objective. So ICAO really has to rethink its role and how to promote the activity without sticking its finger in the activity. And so your assistance at helping us think through how that's going to work is going to continue to be vital for ICAO's success working with the industry here. There is one element to that activity that I had not heard until this week, and I'm really pleased to hear, and that is the applicability of this development work for large, heavy civil aviation metal. We heard Airbus and Boeing both talk about the value of digitizing their identifications so that they can apply new applications and new services to those aircraft that will actually bring benefit for the industry, both in efficiencies, perhaps in airspace change going into the future, but essentially taking what we've been talking about in the trust framework, combining that with the small developments from small drones and smaller operations, the work that's Nancy's about to talk about in the upper air, and building capabilities that have common themes and understandings that are going to be applicable throughout the airspace. So I'm really excited by that, and I think that there's going to be a way, talking with the Air Navigation Commission, that we start to have a dialogue about how that identification can be recognized in the ICAO standards process earlier rather than later. So really good stuff. Next, after yesterday, in this morning, we talked about operational experiences. And Leslie Carey, who you all know, is running my entire life in this realm, was running that moderation. So Leslie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't think I'm ready for quite that big a challenge. But some of the things that we heard about this morning were that there are a lot of similarities. Despite having a very small state and a very large state, a very small civil aviation authority and a relatively large civil aviation authority, the challenges being faced are remarkably similar between them. And that is probably going to prove to be true of almost every civil aviation authority looking at the kinds of challenges they're being faced with all these new operations coming along. The how to regulate, what to regulate. These are all things that I think the more discussion that can be held between the authorities to help each other learn, to share their experiences and best practices, lessons learned, this will be helpful across the board. But they also need to be having those discussions with the operators in a very open, transparent manner. Now, nothing is going to be solved from the beginning. It's going to be an iterative process as we're learning. And one of the points that was raised was that public good use cases are really a great test bed. It's much easier to get approvals to conduct types of operations where society as a whole can buy in on what is being conducted, recognizing the good for society. And then the lessons learned from those can be translated into what do we need for everybody, not just the public good operations. So these are things that, again, we learn as we go. There will not be a one-size-fits-all on these, but we need to be sharing and helping each other through this process.
Thanks, Leslie. I think what you've just said was clearly reinforced by our keynote from the minister in Uganda, or excuse me, in Rwanda, because as he said, there is a public perception, a very clear public perception that the use of drones and small vehicles in the airspace above Rwanda is saving people's lives and has a benefit that outweighs any perceived risk or downside. So that helped in the beginning. And then working from that, of course, you flesh out your risk management and your safety protocols. So really positive steps, and it's good to hear that we're seeing the same thing in Canada and Vanuatu. Now this next panel, it's a perfect example of what happens when you accidentally make up a term and then it sticks with you, right? So international waters, someone decided to call high seas. And 400 years later, we're still doing it. So the next panel was on UAS operations over the high seas. And the panel was moderated by Mr. Mike Boyd, Technical Officer in Airspace Management and Optimization Section. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, it was a nifty panel, actually. It was really good to have some of the coalface users, some of the operators on the panel. Either operating at the behest of the state or in conjunction with the state. So we had some good input. We didn't really get onto too many solutions because we're still grappling with the problem, but I think we made some progress on defining what the problem was, which is key to then being able to solve it. So there's some areas that we kind of tied down a bit. The containment of the operations vertically and horizontally. And we did look at a little bit or touched on altimetry, whether it's GPS or barometric. So there's a few themes that are coming through. Equipage requirements then is tied in with that as well. Licensing and approvals for operators and for pilots. What kind of thought should go into that particular item? Once again, there was a need for granularity. One size is not going to fit all. I think that's a common theme that we've heard this afternoon as we've reviewed back over things. And then, essentially, I think there is an identified need for some kind of harmonization as soon as possible, because the longer we leave it, the further apart various states are going to spread. And it's going to be hard to get them all facing in the same direction again, because people need solutions now. And ICAO just hasn't been in a place to give them those tailor-made solutions. So we're playing a bit of catch-up, but at least we've got the conversation going. That's essentially it. But yeah, it was a good one. I particularly enjoyed Kathy, her input, because she's out there making this work. So. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Now this next panel, it's really hard to tell whether you're over the high seas or not because it's so high above the earth. Cooperative Separation of Stratospheric Operations panel. Nancy Graham, the president of Graham Aerospace, and associated with a lot of things ICAO and a lot of things high altitude, moderated that panel. Nancy?
Thank you, Steve. What you heard from was, again, following the model of cooperative development, working together for solutions. You heard from two very mature operators, two that are coming along, and in the last year you heard from another set. So you, again, recognize that there's quite a lot of commonality in what they're doing, but also a lot of a lot of work and a very high barrier to entry for this particular sector. You heard a little bit about the commonalities, the similarities, and some real differences in their operations between UTM, if you will, upper and UTM lower, and the recognition that the high altitude sector needs to really continue to learn while the UTM continues to mature at the low altitude and apply to the greatest extent possible to the high altitude. That is ongoing. I would like to take the opportunity, because I've had a unique experience of being here in this building and working for 8 years in ICAO, and now working with the industry on the outside. I have to say, there is fundamentally, absolutely a continued need for ICAO support and assistance. The fact that there isn't any money is a different problem, which can be addressed in a different way, but it does yet create a new opportunity for the industry to help to fill that void. So please don't think that ICAO can do it by themselves. They cannot. They cannot. And I think the important thing for ICAO to remember now, the biggest tool you have in your tool chest is guidance material. So yes, your real role is standards and recommended practice, et cetera, but those things are appropriate when they're appropriate. And we aren't anywhere near that in many cases, and yet the operations are ongoing today in very mature areas where learning can be had. So I think digitization of guidance material and early promulgation of version controls of guidance material will be extraordinarily helpful to continue to learn and continue to progress, but also fundamentally important for those states that are where these things are going, which are kind of the non-traditional areas. So they need that guidance more than ever. So I would just encourage the continued industry collaboration and ICAO to continue to think about releasing guidance material early, even though it goes against everything we have been taught about formality and process and over-process and more process. I just think it's the really important tool that you have in your toolbox now, and certainly for this area of high-altitude operations, it's necessary, but I think it applies everywhere. So I just would encourage the continued thinking about how you progress that quickly, but at the same time with the appropriate level of understanding that it is guidance and it is early. So specifically for this sector, and particularly for that panel, the request of ICAO is specifically guidance material that the industry has agreed to cooperate with over the course of the next 2 or 3 years to allow progression in this low-risk environment, the high-altitude operations where we continue to learn.
Thanks, Nancy. I think wise words backed up with experience, and talking to the choir to some degree with the folks from ICAO that you're sitting here with. Ms. Carey and her team have been producing guidance material at an ever-accelerating rate. And one of the things we want to do is be able to differentiate guidance material because it is frequently changing. It has but in a constant direction from standards recommended practices, where we would like to see quite a bit of stability, because the regulatory burden of implementing standards recommended practices around the world is actually quite high. So the guidance material is more valuable in a rapidly iterating environment, and having them fit together is really important from our perspective. So the next panel, we come back to Mr. Dalton, flight rules. It's a little bit of deja vu from a couple of the other things that were discussed, but some interesting dialogue as well. Chris?
Yeah, and it'd be fair to say that the words that you've just spoken and those of Nancy, that theme ran through this session as well. It was good to acknowledge that there's nothing institutionally stopping changes in flight rules in ICAO. Let's just say there's no rules against changing the rules, so that's a good thing. But by the same token, we're not ready yet. We're not sure what we need to do, but there's flexibility already written into the annexes, and that fundamental flexibility will have to run through this new topic with these new entrants. We need to break down the task into more manageable chunks. We talk about upper UTM, lower UTM, and the space in between. Well, the rules are going to be all slightly different for each, and I really don't know how we're going to approach it. We don't need to approach it at the moment. We don't need to change Annex 2 immediately, I don't think. Guidance material, again, would be, useful at this early stage. But a complicating feature, though, is also the rapid change that is occurring as we speak. It's almost like we can't almost grasp the solution before we may have to look at some other perspective. But a very interesting panel and a good lead-in discussion for what will be work for the next 5 or 6, 7 years.
Thanks, Chris. So we've been through a quick recap of all the material that we've had discussed and presented. I want to open the floor, make sure if anybody has anything that they feel like we missed, feedback on a direction or an area within the UAS community where ICAO needs to pay more attention, or that the industry even needs to think about something differently. I'd like to ask the panel members if anybody has any thoughts that have been triggered through just listening to each other here, if you've got anything else that you'd like to raise before we close out. If any of you doesn't want to use the email, you can essentially raise your hand and we'll scan for you and see if we can't get a microphone lit up at the same time. Chris?
I'm reminded of the early symposia that we had with civil-military cooperation. In the first couple of meetings that we had, no one from the military came. And it was only, the discussion only started properly later when we were able to get all parts of the community here. So it's almost like I feel that with some of these drone enables, it would be really interesting to have more of the traditional parts of the community here that have nothing to do with drones being part of the discussion. Otherwise, we might be speaking in a vacuum in this kind of environment. So I just want to thank the 2 helicopter pilots that were here for the discussions during my sessions.
That's a good point, Chris. Thanks. Okay. So a lot of work to do. What I take out of this from the ICAO Secretariat perspective, which we will be in dialogue with the Commission and with the Council, the member states, is that we have to essentially reinvent the way ICAO engages with the community. We've been engaging with the community for 75 years. And we've had an enormous level of success in that engagement. Civil aviation is a wonderful tool for bringing the world together in a very safe, effective way. Most of you flew here. If you went through Chicago, I apologize. But in reality, the system works pretty good. And part of the reason for that is because ideas developed in the local area and were promoted and matured in a methodical way and then spread around the world through the methodologies that are available here at ICAO. And the industry didn't iterate quickly because there's so much cost associated with that iteration. An airplane lasts 20 years to 25 years. Sometimes shorter now, but in the history, that was a very long-term investment. Air traffic management systems, very, very long-term investments. But what we've seen is this change in the tempo of developments in communications technology and computing capability, now in actually methodology for collaboration, that ICAO has the opportunity to learn from the best around the world. And today, that best is frequently in this industry. People who are iterating designs at a very rapid rate, testing to fail, learning from the fail, rebuilding and moving on to the next step. And that methodology and that philosophy are actually incredibly valuable for us here at ICAO, not to be on the front end of, but to have awareness of and to be able to assist with the communication between all the different stakeholders in the community. It's a shift in our role because we will not be the experts. And having that recognition is something that's been hard for us because we kind of prided ourselves on being the experts in airworthiness or air traffic control, airport operations. But that's simply not possible when this is an industry that's been invented since most of us work here. So we will be relying on all of you in the industry, both the new industry and the traditional industry. As you're learning your lessons, we have to find a way of lifting those lessons out of the field rapidly, sharing them between all of these different stakeholder interests, and then having that be applicable into the next version. I feel a lot of dynamic tension from the people who are involved in that. Well, yesterday when we had our panel, we had a fairly dynamic conversation because I had standards people of different methodologies and different constituencies who have a different way of doing business that has not been reconciled. It doesn't need to be reconciled, but it needs to be shared. And the information we have to find a way of sharing between the industry players, the ANSPs, especially the regulators, because my view is a safety regulator who does not understand your product is essentially the definition of no. They are not going to approve the operation that you want to perform and be engaged in if they don't have that understanding. ICAO's role is to help them be able to say yes as you're iterating and developing these capabilities. So keep those ideas coming about how we do that, because we won't create all those ideas here. You will. And our phone's open, our computers, we're listening. We're going to try as quickly as we can to incorporate those ideas and to incorporate you into the ICAO methodology, because that's where we get the resource. So I've essentially done the next steps, Leslie, from my perspective. And I'm going to ask you to chime in and essentially give us some of the concrete stuff. Before you do that, I want to thank the panel members for your moderation through this process, the hard work that you went through to get everything set up for these sessions. Folks, these 1 hour sessions, they aren't just 1 hour. There's a bunch of preload that people do to make that possible. So the work that we've done in the Secretariat is actually support for all that hard work by the presenters and the moderators. I'd like to ask everybody to join me in a round of applause. And that, of course, goes to all of you in the audience who were presenters as well, and those of you in the audience who have been engaging in this process. Leslie, the microphone's yours.
Slide along one. All right. Thank you, Steve. And I'd like to also say thank you to everybody for having a wonderful 3 days with a whole lot of information that's been presented. So the real question becomes, all right, information was presented, now what? Well, the now what comes back to Mark Wunneberg and the UAS Advisory Group. They will be spending tomorrow sitting in a room together here in the building trying to digest what they've just been hearing across 3 days. They've got lots of notes. They have our fine YouTube videos that they can go back and have a look at as they need to. But they will be working on turning what has been presented here this week, as well as the other presentations that were submitted. They'll be turning that into the next iteration of the UTM framework. That UTM framework that we post online so that everybody has access to it. So that's the single biggest thing coming from this event, the continuous updating, expanding of the UTM framework document. We will also be working to finalize those advisory circulars and the humanitarian guidance material that I told you about on Tuesday, and those will be posted online before the end of this month. And the RPAS panel, of course, will be continuing its work with all of the SARP's development and the RPAS manual revisions. So there is a great deal of work underway here at ICAO. It will all continue. The one other thing that we need to announce is that we have had a slight change related to Drone Enable 4. We have decided the dates that everybody has already seen that are on the Save Your Date cards out in the lobby, the location has changed. So if we could advance one slide there, please. How about joining us in Rio de Janeiro next September? There should be no chance of snow. So that is a very pleasant change that I hope that you will be able to accept and join us there. And I believe we have a video to show. So clearly, Brazil has offered to host us, and in particular, DSEA. So ICAO has accepted that offer, and we will be moving to Rio next September. Thank you, Brazil.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the program content for the symposium. But before I close, I'd like to, on behalf of the leadership at ICAO and frankly all of you, I'd like to acknowledge the Secretariat's support beyond just the RPAS team, all of the folks in conference services, building services, catering, and other organizations who've helped to assist us here. And again, thanks to all of you for your participation and attendance. We look forward to seeing you next year in Rio de Janeiro and in between at a panel or a study group meeting near you. Thank you.